大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Michael Lewis 嘅 Liar's Poker， 讀到第9節啊 The Art of War。咁上一回呢個核心呢又翻去作者本人啦，佢係倫敦嘅分部 Salomon Brothers 嘅分部，佢嘅取巧啦，聽從咗佢選擇性咁樣模仿啦、抄襲啦，佢認為值得模仿嘅同事啦，絕對唔係啲咩學者啊，唔係。
somewhere had made a statement, but there was no such news. I told Alexander that several Arabs had sold massive holdings of gold, for which they received dollars. They were selling those dollars for marks and thereby driving the dollar lower. I spent much of my working life inventing logical lies like this. Most of the time when markets move, no one has any idea why. A man who can tell a good story can make a good living as a broker. It was the job of people like me to make up reasons, to spin a plausible yarn. And it's amazing that people would believe. Heavy selling out of the Middle East was an old standby. Since no one ever had any clue what the Arabs were doing with their money or why, no story involving Arabs could ever be refuted. So if you didn't know why the dollar was falling, you shouted out something about Arabs. Alexander, of course, had a keen sense of the value of my commentary. He just laughed. There was a more pressing matter to discuss. One of my customers was certain that the German bond market was due for a rise. He wanted to make a big bet on it. This Alexander found more interesting. If one investor felt strongly about German bonds, perhaps others did too, and would drive that market higher. There are lots of ways to make the same bet. Up to that point, my customer had simply bought hundreds of millions of Deutschmarks worth of German government bonds. I wondered if there wasn't a more daring play to be made in the market. This is a typical thought for a person who was becoming overly accustomed to betting other people's money. Alexander and I sorted out my jumbled thoughts, and in the process we stumbled across a great idea, an entirely new security. My client loved risk. Risk, I had learned, was a commodity in itself. Risk could be canned and sold like tomatoes. Different investors place different prices on risk. If you are able, as it were, to buy risk from one investor cheaply and sell it to another investor dearly, you can make money without taking any risk yourself. And this is what we did. My client wanted to take a big risk by wagering a large sum of money on German bonds rising. He was therefore the buyer of risk. Alexander and I created a security called a warrant or a call option, which was a means of transferring risk from one party to another. In buying our warrant, risk-averse investors from around the world would be, in effect, selling us risk. Many of these investors would not know they wanted to sell risk on the German bond market until we suggested it to them with our new warrant, just as most people didn't know they wanted to plug their ears all day and listen to Pink Floyd until Sony produced a Walkman. Part of our job was to fill needs that investors never knew they had. We'd rely on Salmon's sales force to generate demand for our new product, which, because it was unique, was pretty sure to succeed. The difference between what we paid cautious investors for the risk and what we sold it to my customer for would be our profits. We estimated these would come to about $700,000. The idea was a dream. Salmon Brothers, which sat in the middle of this transfer of risk, would take no risk whatsoever. 700,000 risk-free dollars was a refreshing sight for Salmon management, but never more important as far as Salmon was concerned was the novelty of our deal. A warrant on German interest rates was new. A publicity of being the first investment bank ever to issue them was the sort of thing that drives investment bankers mad with desire. As we hashed out the deal, people on the trading floor began to grow curious. A vice president from another area of the trading floor, a salesman usually responsible for taking with large corporations, started to sniff around. I'll call this man the opportunist. He decided that it was his mission to play a part in our deal. I voiced no objection. He had worked at Salomon for 6 years, twice as long as Alexander and I combined, and we could use his experience. The opportunist, for his part, had nothing else to do. Bonus time was fast approaching. He desperately wanted to distinguish himself and saw our deal as his chance. To be fair, the opportunist was not entirely without purpose. We had overlooked the need to obtain the approval of the German government, and the opportunist saved us from embarrassment. The German government had no say in the euro markets. The beauty of the euro market was that it fell under no government's jurisdiction. We could, in theory, have ignored the Germans, but we had to be polite. Salmon Brothers hoped to open an office in Frankfurt, and the last thing the firm needed was angry German politicians. So the opportunist became our emissary to the German finance ministry. He persuaded the authorities that our deal would neither undermine their ability to control their money supply nor encourage speculation in German interest rates. You had to give him credit for playing to the sensibilities of his audience. He wisely wore camouflage on his trips to Frankfurt, long-term investor brown. Brown suits, brown shoes, and brown ties. No red suspenders with gold dollar signs. No gold cufflinks. Playing his part of a sober burgher, he won the confidence of senior officials in the ministry, right up, I believe, to the Minister of Finance himself. In several weeks of talks, there were only small hiccups. In one of the meetings, it was reported the Germans were upset at the media attention the deal might attract. Not fully understanding all the implications of our warrant, they feared having their good name too closely associated with it. We said we would keep publicity to a minimum. They asked about the tombstone, the public announcement that would appear in the financial press at the end of the deal. We said that we wanted a tombstone, but that we wouldn't advertise it in the press. They agreed to let us have our tombstone on the condition that we didn't print upon it the symbol of the Federal Republic of Germany, the eagle. We jokingly suggested a swastika as a substitute. Apparently, they didn't find that as funny as I did. That was our one break with sobriety. When the deal finally went through, it was a smashing success. Salmon Brothers and my customer made out like bandits. It was clear that Alexander and I were in for a bit of local fame. The opportunists, too, deserved applause. Then the trouble began. The afternoon on which the deal was launched, a memo was circulated in London and New York, describing how the deal had been done. No mention of the memo was made of Alexander, my client, or myself. The memo was signed The Opportunist. It was a subtle but effective stunt. As incredible as it may sound to those unfamiliar with the business, none of the bosses in neither New York or London fully understood what we had done. Anyone who has been in the business knows this is the norm, and by explaining the deal to senior management, the opportunist made it seem as if he were entirely responsible for it. It was so clearly unjust, so wildly deceitful, that I should have laughed. At the time, however, it didn't seem funny. I headed toward his desk to do him violence. Throwing phones was okay. Shouting abuse was okay. Pounding a colleague to mush was not. had represented himself as the sole source of warrant wisdom, and if that could be disapproved, he would, to an extent, be discredited. We conceived another deal, similar enough to the first as to be unmistakably from the same hand. It involved the government bonds of Japan, not Germany, and had a slightly different underlying structure, the details of which, for my present purposes, are irrelevant. With the deal structured, I didn't go to the opportunist and ask him to play emissary to the relevant government. The opportunist was told what he deserved to know, nothing. And then, before the deal came off, I did my own lab of the 41st floor of New York. Call it a warm-up lab. A warm-up lab, unlike a victory lab, could be done by telephone. I made several calls. The opportunist, though he liked to claim that he reported directly to John Griffin, had a boss. His boss sat on the 41st floor and was still basking in the reflected glory of his minion. Suddenly, the boss found himself in an awkward situation. Several men of his rank ripped him about the new Japanese deal, saying in effect, "It seems that the brains of this operation may have been somewhere other than in the head of your employee." The opportunist boss called the opportunist to ask why he hadn't been informed of this new deal. The opportunist did not know about the deal either, nor did he convincingly demonstrate that he understood it. My phone bombs had found their target. I was willing to stop being a pig and leave the matter at that. He wasn't. About an hour after I had completed my warm-up lab, the opportunist was standing over me, glaring. I was surprised by how huffy he was. It was all I could do to stifle a chuckle. He looked the way I felt when I first read his memo. He had convinced himself, I think, that the German warrant had been his idea all along. I gave him the closet I could manage to a smile, which I'm afraid must have seemed like a cheese-eating grin. "Come with me for a minute," he said. "Sorry, I'm busy," I lied. "We'll have to do it another time." "I'll be here at 8 o'clock tonight. You should be too," he said. I would have skipped out, but as it happened, I was required to be in my seat at 8 o'clock that night for other reasons. So unfortunately, we met. "Come into Charlie's office," said the opportunist at precisely 8 o'clock. Charlie was our chairman. One of the opportunist's more charming habits was that, though he was but a mere dime a dozen vice president, he used the office of our chairman as if it were his own. As expected, he took the seat behind the desk. I took the chair on the other side and felt like a schoolboy about to be scolded. He was the thief, I reminded myself. Perhaps I give Salomon Brothers too much credit, and myself too little. But I think that what crossed my mind next would never have done so before I set foot on the trading floor. In short, I decided to do him in. For the purpose, I found Machiavellian resources I hadn't known I possessed, which is saying something. The joy of having the upper hand swept over me. Instead of being uneasy or anxious or angry, I suddenly relished the thought of calculated confrontation. It was clear how to do maximum damage, to say as little as possible and give him a chance to say something he shouldn't. The opportunist had had a chance to calm down. He was painfully deliberate as he began to speak. He was sane in every respect but one, and that was his stratospheric sense of self-importance. He was smart, I'll give him that. What he didn't realize was that everybody else was smart too. He had one foot up on the desk and was looking down at an object, a pen, I think, he held in his hand. He jiggled the object in his palm, quick-like. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "I gave you more credit," he said. "Most of the people around here are stupid. I thought you were smarter than that." Most of the people around Salomon was distinctly not stupid, but it was the sort of thing he would say. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I got a call from. And he said you've been spreading the word about a Japanese warrant," he said. "So what?" I asked. "So why didn't you tell me? What do you think you're doing?" he asked. He paused for a moment, then continued. "You can't do a deal without my help. I can stop your deal from happening with a single phone call." He then listed several $1 billion worth of deals in the past that were or weren't done by Salomon Brothers because of him. "Why on earth would you interfere with my deal if it's going to be a profitable piece of business?" I asked. I knew precisely why he would interfere with a profitable piece of business. If he wasn't going to get the credit, he didn't want to see it happen. It would shatter the illusion he was trying to create of having a unique grasp of his new warrant business. If he succeeded in creating the illusion, the firm would pay him more money at the end of the year. Of all this, I was aware. He knew I was aware. That made him angry, and getting angry was his biggest mistake. "I can get you fired," he said. "With a single phone call, all I've got to do is call, or John, and you are out of here." That was it. I had just drawn the fourth ace. The opportunist was bluffing, and it was written all over his face. Sitting on the trading floor all day makes you that much sensitive to people's little bluffs. They were almost always transparent, and once you caught them, you owned them. Like a fish well hooked. You could let them off the hook, or you could reel them in. In this case, I had already made up my mind what to do. The opportunist was way out of line. He couldn't get me fired, not even close. What is more, a lot of people would be angry when they learned of his threat. He had stepped, albeit in a way I didn't expect, into trouble. I've never had a plot to destroy someone work out so well before. Come to think of it, I've never before had a plot to destroy anyone. There was no point in continuing. I feigned concern. I told him that I was sorry, that I would never do it again, and that whenever I had a good idea in the future, I would be sure to run straight away and give it to him. Somehow, he believed me. What the opportunist had neglected to consider in his scheme was the omniscient, omnipotent, omnivorous presence. No, not God. A person on the trading floor known as a syndicate manager. Syndicate managers on Wall Street and in the City of London are charged with the job of coordinating all deals. The London syndicate manager of Salomon, one of the few powerful women within the firm, had coordinated our German warrant. Syndicate managers are the investment banking equivalents of chiefs of staff in the White House or general managers of professional sports teams. John Goodfriend had made his reputation as a syndicate manager. The role produces masters of Realpolitik, Machiavellian in the original sense of the word. They see all, they hear all, they know all. You don't cross the syndicate manager. If you do, you get hurt. The next day, I told the London syndicate manager of my conversation the previous night. She knew the truth of the German warrant deal because she had played a role in its success. She was even angrier than I had hoped. She was also extremely plugged in at Salomon Brothers, in a way that the opportunist was not. I mercilessly left his fate in her hands. It was like leaving a goldfish in the care of an alley cat. Only then, after it was too late to reverse the process, did I feel remorse. But not much. Even my conscience was becoming calculating, permitting me to feel just enough guilt to live with myself, but not enough to prevent me from doing in creeps. I didn't learn until much later the end of the story. The woman I had spoken with was directly responsible for deciding what the opportunist was paid. The opportunist was expecting a lot of money and a promotion from vice president to director. The promotion was critical to his future. This woman made 5 or 6 phone calls and squashed his plans. I had to wait until bonus time, the end of December, to see the effect. Promotions were announced a week before the money was passed out. The opportunist remained a vice president. Once his bonus had landed in his bank account, he quit the firm. At this point in the story, in the fall of 1986, ordinary salesmen were on the telephone all day, every day with the source of our revenues, European institutional investors, and Salmon salespeople in December 1986 heard a new tone in their customers' voices and saw a couple of coincidental changes at once to which management was blind.
First, investors were increasingly irritated with the slash-and-burn approach Salmon Brothers and other American investment banks took to customer relations. People who controlled enormous pools of capital were refusing to buy their stocks and bonds from us. You must understand, a weary French female investor told me one day as she fended off a Salmon Brothers priority. We are tired of being ripped off by Drexel Burnham and Goldman Sachs and Salmon Brothers and the other Americans. There is, or was, a fundamental difference between European institutional investors and their American counterparts, noticed by every New York trader who spent any time in our office. Investment banking in America is a long-standing oligopoly. A small number of name investment banks compete to raise capital. American investors have been trained to think that they can only do business with a handful of large investment banks, and very generally, the interests of lenders in New York take a backseat to the interests of the corporate borrowers. So in New York, bond and stock deals are driven not by whether investors want to buy them, but by whether companies want to raise the money. I was never sure why this happened. I mean, you'd think that the borrower of money would be just as likely to be screwed by the middleman as the lender, but he isn't. The Wall Street oligopoly that costs lenders so dearly doesn't seem to affect the borrowers, perhaps because they are smart enough to play the few investment banks off against one another, perhaps because they are less dependent on Wall Street in the first place. After all, if they don't like the terms on a bond deal, they can always take a loan from a bank. Anyway, no one dreams of trying to fool, say, IBM into issuing cheap stocks or bonds. IBM is regarded as too important to anger, and therefore always issue its stocks and bonds dear. Wall Street salesmen then try to fool investors into buying the overpriced merchandise. European lenders didn't know how to roll over and play dead. You could sucker them once, but if you did, they'd never come back. Unlike their American counterparts, they didn't understand that they couldn't live without the services of Salmon Brothers. A salmon trader in New York once told me, the problem with the London office is that the customers aren't trained. But why should they be? If they didn't like us, they could simply deal with an English or French or Japanese competitor. Whether the foreign banks were more user-friendly than we, I do not know. What was clear, however, is that hundreds of firms could do most of what we did. One could not, and I would not attempt to persuade our management of this sad fact. Its response would have been to shoot the messenger. But I recall at the time a short trip to Geneva, where I met with a man in control of a mere $86 million, who put the matter in a nutshell for me. As we sat in his office speaking, one of his accountants barged in, waving a sheet of paper. 285, he said, then left. The figure 285, it turned out, was the number of different investment banks he had dealt with in the previous year. If the episode was staged to psych me out, it worked. I didn't know, I gulped, that there were 285 investment bankers in the whole world. There aren't, he said. There are more, and they are all the same. In other words, the whole idea of globalization was a canard. The brave new world of advanced communications in a single worldwide market for capital did not necessarily imply that a small handful of investment banks, such as Salomon, would dominate the world. It meant that money bounced more freely around the globe. But there didn't seem to be the same economies of scale in handling the money as in, say, frozen green beans. Debt issuance and bond trading were no longer the domain of a single firm, but of hundreds. Many of the new players didn't share our exalted sense of self-worth. Japanese banks such as Nomura, American commercial banks such as Morgan Guarantee, and European monoliths like Credit Suisse all were willing to do the same job as Salmon Brothers in Europe, and for far less pay. Even tiny firms of 6 men in dingy offices with low overheads were able to compete by slashing prices to the bone. They had the same information we did. Information, with communications, was becoming cheaper and easier to obtain. We were being driven from our markets by lower-cost foreign producers, just as American steel and automobile companies were before us. Our poor management had been saddled with an impossible task.
The orders received from the New York War Room bore no relation to conditions in the field. The London office had been charged by John Gutfreund and Tom Strauss with implementing a flawed strategy. Gutfreund and Strauss were still enamored with the notion of global domination. They were inclined to blame their lieutenants for poor execution of a brilliant plan rather than question the plan itself. The lieutenants responded with a resounding chorus of the Salmon Brothers in Europe theme song called It's Not My Fault, I Only Just Got Here. That was true. The London managers, like the geeks, were too new to the market to question the strategy. Miles later, our chief executive officer was a 43-year-old American who hadn't arrived in London until June 1986, 6 months after I did. Bruce Kovgan, the head of sales, was a 34-year-old American who arrived in London for the first time in 1985, 6 months before I did. The chairman of the operation, Charlie McFay, was a 45-year-old American who had a great deal of experience but was more the firm's diplomat than its manager. At no time had there been a managing director of Salmon Brothers in London who spoke any language but English. In November 1986, our offices moved from the Donut in the heart of London's financial district into the airspace immediately above Victoria Station, now named Victoria Plaza. The new office was nearly as large as the station itself and more a sign of our optimism than our needs. When I saw the opening of the London office, says William Salomon, with a trading floor twice as big as New York's, I saw excess to the greatest degree. Our grand new place was only a short walk down Buckingham Palace Road from that saintly creature, the Queen Mother. A long escalator ran from the Street of Kings through the passage of chrome and mirrors to the dizzy heights of our trading floor. The trading floor wasn't at the top of the escalator. That would have been too economical. At the top of the escalator was a massive space with the feel of a Hyatt Regency lobby, filled with sofas, plants, and an enormous bronze statue of a sprinting rabbit. The rabbit was a non sequitur. Its design did not suggest a Wall Street firm bravely speeding into the future as so much as Bugs Bunny scampering between holes one step ahead of Elmer Fudd. At Christmas time, the traders hung huge silver ornaments from the rabbit's tail to give it Later, the divine creator in a year's time to be told your worth as a human being, you'd be a little edgy about the whole thing too, wouldn't you? That's roughly what we endured. The people felt a wave of pure emotion wrapped over them immediately on the heels of a year of single-minded pursuit of success, and it made the stomachs churn. Worse, they had to hide it. The game had to be played. It was rude to gloat too soon after being paid and embarrassing to show anger. The people who had its best felt unpunctuated relief. They had been paid pretty much what they had expected. No surprise, no reaction. Good. That made it easier to seem impassive. It was over. My own compensation meeting was late in the day. I met with my jungle guide, Stu Williker, and the sales manager of the London office, Bruce Kofkin, and in one of the Gone with the Wind dining rooms. My jungle guide simply listened and smiled. Kofkin, said to be destined for greatness in Salomon Brothers, spoke for the organization. I'd like to say I was as cold and calculating as a hitman facing a mafia don after the job has been done, but that just wouldn't be true. I was more on edge than I had expected. All I, or anyone else, really wanted to know was the size of my bonus, but I had to sit through a much longer speech for reasons I didn't at first understand. The managing director shuffled some papers in front of him and then began. I've seen a lot of people come through here and shoot the lights out in their first year, he said, and then named a few young managing directors as examples. But I've never seen anyone have the kind of year that you've had. He began to list names again. Not Bill, not Rick, not Joe, he said, and then not even the human piranha, not even the human piranha. What can I say, he said, but congratulations. He spoke for about 5 minutes and achieved the desired effect. When he finished, I was prepared to pay him for the privilege of working at Salomon Brothers. And I thought I knew how to sell. The boss put my small abilities to shame. He pushed all the right buttons. Most of the cynicism and bitterness I was developing for the organization melted. I felt deeply reverent about the firm. My numerous bosses, John Goodfriend, the AT&T trader, and everybody who had ever had anything to do with Salomon Brothers except perhaps the opportunist. I didn't care about money. I just wanted this man to approve of my performance. I began to understand why they gave you a talk before they give you the money. Like priests, paymasters in the Salomon Empire followed a time-honored pattern. The money always came as an afterthought, and in a knot you had to disentangle. Last year you made $90,000, he said. 45 was salary, so 45 was bonus. Next year your salary will be $60,000. Now let me explain those numbers. While he was explaining that I was paid more than anyone else in my training class, I was converting $90,000 into British pounds and putting that into perspective. It was certainly more than I was worth in the abstract. It was more than I had contributed to society. Christ, if social contribution had been a measure, I should have been billed rather than paid at the end of the year. It was more than my father had made when he was 26, even factoring in inflation, which I did. It was more than anyone else my age I knew made. Ha! I was rich. I loved my employer. My employer loved me. I was happy. Then the meeting ended. And I thought again. When I had a moment to reflect, I decided I wasn't so pleased. Weird, huh? This was Salomon Brothers, remember? These were the same people who made me blowing up customers with exploding AT&T bonds. They were perfectly capable of turning the same firepower on me as they used on my customers. I had done their dirty work for a year and had only a few $1,000s to show for it. Money out of my pocket was money in the pocket of the man who has sung my praises. He knew that better than I. Words were cheap. He knew that too. I decided in the end I had been taken for a ride, a view I still think is strictly correct. I wasn't sure how many millions of dollars I had made for Salomon Brothers, but by any fair measure, I deserved much more than $90,000. By the standards of our monopoly money business, 90 grand was like being on welfare. I felt cheated, genuinely indignant. How else could I feel? I looked around me and saw people getting much more when they hadn't generated a penny of the revenues themselves. You don't get rich in this business, said Alexander when I complained privately to him. You only attain new levels of relative poverty. You think Goodfriend feels rich? I'll bet not. Weissman, Alexander. He studied Buddhism, which he liked to use to explain his detachment. On the other hand, he was 3 full years out of the training program and no longer constrained by the band. The firm had just paid him a fantastic sum of money. He could afford his lofty sentiment. He had, however, put his finger on the insatiable hunger for more felt by anyone who had succeeded in Salomon Brothers and probably at any Wall Street firm. The hunger, or, if you will, the greed took different forms, some of which were healthier for Salomon Brothers than others. The most poisonous was the desire to have more now, short-term greed rather than long-term greed. People who are short-term greed aren't loyal. Salomon Brothers people in 1986 wanted their money now because it looked as if the firm were heading for disaster. Who knew what 1987 would bring? Shortly after bonus time, London traders and salespeople, along with many Aries people in New York, began to stream out the door for more money elsewhere. Big guarantees were still being made by other firms to Salomon traders and salesmen. The older employees, who were playing for real money, had been bitterly disappointed. They had expected, say, 800,000 and had received only 450,000. There simply wasn't enough to go around. It had been a terrible year for the firm, yet somehow each person individually felt he had done well. A year after I arrived, I was able to look around me and count on 2 hands and a foot in the number of people who had been with the firm longer than I. All but 3 of the 20 or so older Europeans who had set the office pace in the age of the 2-bottle lunch had left for greener pastures. Each was quickly replaced with half a dozen.
At 29 and I find myself wondering what did happen to the last 10. I ran away with my life, fast forward, never turn back again. It's kind of funny that the more we pass time, the more we need to set them rewind. And 19 was the year I had to leave you, but now I'm seeing all the signs. Is this really happening? I can't believe it's true. I'm just as surprised as you. Is this really happening? I can't be too sure, but one day I'll be yours again. Life lessons come 1 in a dozen. The other 11 give something from nothing. I sit here looking for an answer. Maybe the biggest question was in the last chapter. You gave me the soul I have today. Without you I never could have moved away. But now I see what you teach. I do believe I always should have stayed. Yeah. Is this really happening? I can't believe it's true. I'm just as surprised as you. Is this really happening? I can't be too sure, but one day I'll be yours again. One day I'll be yours. One day I'll be yours. One day I'll be yours. Life lessons come 1 in a dozen. The other 11 give something from nothing. Life lessons come 1 in a dozen. The other 11 give something from nothing. Life lessons come 1 in a dozen. The other 11 give something from nothing. Life changes just open the door. One thing's certain, I'll always be yours. Is this really happening? I can't believe it's true. I'm just as surprised as you. Is this really happening? I can't be too sure, but one day I'll be yours. Yeah. Is this really happening? I can't believe it's true. I'm just as surprised as
大篇幅講佢親身經歷嘅權鬥啦，同事之間嘅爾虞我詐啦，佢稱呼佢嘅對手啦係一個機會主義者啦嚇。但係喺我哋讀者立場，即係如果你唔係機會主義者，你又點會入行呢嚇？作者似乎都會將自己擺喺道德高地嘅嚇。anyway 啦，咁呢度亦都有提到作者，即係到最後都係認為 Salomon Brothers 冇俾翻一個相稱嘅收入俾佢，哪怕佢嘅收入係遠遠比佢嘅同期嘅同學啦、佢嘅爸爸啦，或者佢所認識嘅人咧為高，佢都認為 Salomon Brothers 係有少少可以話甚至乎出賣咗佢啦，佢感到好失望啦咁樣。其實都指出咗即係喺當時嗰個經濟環境，嗰個 Wall Street 嗰個環境就係其實 Salomon Brothers 已經冇咗一個優勢，佢亦都唔係做獨市生意，佢哋嘅資訊其他行亦都有，其他行甚至可以做得更平，可以同佢做同一樣嘅產品，債券類嘅產品。接落嚟會點呢？我相信就當然係市場會崩潰啦，連帶 Salomon Brothers 都會一齊 crash and burn 啦。咁啊，睇下作者嚟緊會點樣去描寫佢身處嘅 Salomon 同埋佢自己嘅前路會係點。好，林仔同大家分享幾個字啊。Tirade 一個名詞嚟嘅，意思即係 a long angry speech of criticism or accusation， 一啲好長篇大論嘅指責啊。Realpolitik 呢個係一個德文嚟嘅，引入德文字。名詞嚟嘅 ，a system of politics or principles based on practical rather than moral or ideological considerations， 一啲比較實用嘅政治，務實政治啊。Canard 名詞嚟嘅 ，an unfounded rumor or story， 一啲謊報啊。咁啊，文中就有講到啦，有關 Salomon。唔知係Salomon內部啊，定係Salomon對外嘅一啲人工又好啦、債券啦、一啲嘅消息啦，都係 Canard 啊，都係一啲大話嚟嘅。OK， 好，今日講呢度，下一次再同大家繼續，拜拜。